Many children love traveling to summer camps, going on trips outside the city, or even journeying to other countries. It's a great opportunity to see something new and expand their knowledge of the world around them. However, sometimes these trips can turn into horrific events and transform into an investigation of a terrible crime that gains international attention. Brittany, located in France, in the area of Le Puy, is an extremely picturesque region that is considered quite safe. Therefore, every year thousands of schoolchildren from various countries traveled and continue to travel to France, and the same situation was observed in 1996. In mid-July, a group of students from Cornwall, England, including Caroline Dickinson, arrived in Brittany. The girl found herself among 40 schoolchildren who went on a trip together with 5 teachers. Caroline, who was visiting another European country for the first time, was an ordinary 13-year-old student who watched everything happening around her with great interest. The girl was a little upset because she went without her best friend. Her mother asked the teacher to look after her daughter. Despite some shyness, Caroline quickly got along with the other children, and the group set off for the small village of Pleine-Fougères. The trip organizers planned to accommodate the 40 British schoolchildren in a youth hostel. Pleine-Fougères was a tiny village with only a few small shops and bars. The population was barely 3,000 inhabitants. All this only fueled Caroline's curiosity, for whom visiting such small cozy towns was a novelty. On July 18, 1996, the girls settled in a hostel for foreign guests and communicated with peers with great pleasure. She especially became friends with Camille. Unfortunately, the friends were assigned to different rooms. There were several bunk beds in Camille's room, but all the places were occupied. Caroline did not want to go to her bedroom, so she brought her mattress, put it on the floor between the large beds and decided to spend the night there. Before going to bed, Camille talked with her new friend for a long time, and then the girls began to fall asleep little by little. The last thing Camille remembered was how she and Caroline sang the song of a popular star before drifting off to sleep. When the girls woke up the next morning, they saw Caroline lying on the floor in an unnatural position, her eyes wide open. The girls called her name, but she did not respond, her body was already cold. A horrifying scream rang out in the room, attracting the attention of the teachers. They immediately ran to the bedroom and were stunned by the terrible discovery, immediately calling the police. The gendarmes who arrived at the scene realized that a terrible murder had occurred, the girl had died under extremely horrific circumstances. The entire community of Pleine-Fougères was shocked by the tragedy that had happened. The event turned out to be so traumatic that many people were simply unable to speak. The girl was raped, and the cause of death was suffocation caused by a wad of cotton that was found deep in her throat. It blocked her airways and Caroline suffocated. She was known as a diligent and decent girl, she studied well and worked hard. Thanks to this, she was able to achieve considerable success in school. Caroline had a pleasant friendly disposition, was a member of the school orchestra, and played the clarinet. What happened shocked not only the families of the students, but also the French village, where nothing like this had ever happened before. There was a lot of mystery in the crime. In particular, it seemed incomprehensible how the perpetrator was able to get into a room where 5 children were sleeping at once, and do it imperceptibly, and deal with one of them without waking the others. How did he manage to get into the hostel at all, remaining unnoticed by teachers and security? The detectives quickly figured out how an outsider could have ended up in the building. It turned out that according to the fire safety requirements of that time, the entrances and exits could not be kept locked, and some of them remained unattended. Through these doors, any stranger could freely enter the building. When the girls who shared a room with Caroline recovered a little from the horrific tragedy, the police were finally able to talk to them. There were 2 witnesses who noticed something suspicious that fatal night. One woke up in the middle of the night and heard quiet moans and some stirring from Caroline's side. But she thought that her roommate was just having a nightmare and did not attach any importance to it. Another girl woke up at about the same time and saw a shadow flashing across the room to the exit. But she also decided that it was probably one of the girls who got up at night to go to the toilet or something like that. There were no screams or other horrific sounds that would have attracted attention. According to the initial reconstruction of events, on that night Caroline decided to sleep on the floor between the two bunk beds of her friends, because she wanted to stay in the same room with them. Probably around 4 o'clock in the morning on July 18, an unknown man entered the hostel, taking advantage of the unlocked doors. He went up the stairs to the floor and found his future victim sleeping on the floor. The attacker stuffed a huge wad of cotton into her mouth, apparently so that the girl would not scream, and then raped her. Then, having deprived Caroline of her life, the criminal disappeared. At about this time, one of the teachers, who was awakened by some suspicious noise, looked out the window of the hostel. She noticed a stranger driving away on a motorcycle, but decided that he was just passing by. Later, it was from the words of this woman that a composite sketch of the criminal was made. Seeing the unknown man, she checked the rooms where the children were sleeping, but did not notice anything suspicious. Everyone was lying in their places and seemed to be sleeping peacefully. She did not turn on the light and wake everyone up, because there were no obvious reasons, so she just went back to her bed. The murder investigation was conducted under conditions of strict secrecy. The details were not disclosed, which was strikingly different from the methods used in England in similar cases. When press conferences were held, the public was involved in the investigation in order to gather as much information as possible. One way or another, the method chosen by the French detectives yielded results quite quickly. Already in 2 days it was announced that the person who confessed to the murder of Caroline Dickinson had been caught. The suspect turned out to be a 40-year-old man named Patrick Spad, who was a local homeless person. The main reason for suspicion about him was considered to be that he was prone to sexually based attacks and had already committed rape. In addition, Patrick had an addiction to alcohol and drugs. His lifestyle also raised doubts. Since Caroline Dickinson was raped, biological samples of the perpetrator were collected from her body. After Patrick provided data for analysis, the profiles were compared, but they did not match. The police were forced to release this main suspect and cross him off the list, and there were simply no others. So, the investigation returned to the starting point, no clues remained, and it seemed that the case had reached a dead end. After all the necessary examinations, the body of the deceased schoolgirl was delivered to her parents in England. An incredibly large number of people came to the funeral. Everyone hoped that the criminal would be caught in the near future. Unfortunately, over the next few months, it was not possible to find a single person who would arouse suspicion. The investigation stalled, and even a year later the situation did not change. Many people condemned the French police for their wrong approach and unprofessionalism. They lost the trail of the killer by focusing all their attention on Patrick Spad, who turned out to be uninvolved. The inability of the French police forced Caroline Dickinson's father, named Jean, to return to the small village in Brittany on the anniversary of his daughter's death. The man publicly appealed for help. He refreshed the tragic events associated with the death of the 13-year-old schoolgirl in the memory of local residents, urged all the villagers to provide any information they had in this case. The man begged for help, hoping to finally punish the guilty. The parents of the dead girl were extremely dissatisfied with the actions of the detectives, who kept the investigation secret and did not involve the public in the search for witnesses. This led to the fact that potential eyewitnesses who could have valuable information were never found. Therefore, the family decided to start their own investigation, despite the fact that they practically did not speak French. The mother and father also knew almost nothing about the methods and system of justice in France, but carefully analyzed everything. It took a lot of time, but in the end they came to the conclusion that the approach used was extremely ineffective. The parents were shocked when they learned that even the fingerprints from the crime scene were not collected. On the first day, the investigators simply walked around the houses of local residents and talked to them, but at the same time, the chief detective refused to collect DNA samples from all the men in the village, although there were not so many of them there. It seemed absurd, especially considering the thoughtfulness of the killer's actions. The victim's father was convinced that the criminal lived here or somewhere nearby, was well oriented in the area, so he was able to come and go unnoticed. The more the parents delved into the details of the work of the French police, the stronger the indignation they felt. Finally, they decided to turn to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to demand pressure on representatives of French law enforcement agencies and conduct a more thorough investigation. Thanks to the campaign they launched, in August 1997, the request was granted. The gendarmes were under powerful pressure from the mass media, which even led to the dismissal of the detectives who were engaged in the initial investigation in France. The new investigator immediately drew attention to the mistakes made at the beginning. Meager evidence was decided to be considered from a different angle, and most of the information was rechecked. Due to the fact that more than a year had passed since the murder, all this turned out to be an extremely difficult task. Key witnesses to the crime were re-interviewed, and based on their testimonies, a new composite sketch of the probable killer was created. All information was immediately made public in order not to repeat past mistakes. In addition, the court granted the request of the victim's parents, who insisted on conducting DNA testing of the entire male population of the town where their daughter died. This became the first mass DNA testing in the history of forensic science in Britain. Caroline's father had previously been convinced that the perpetrator was one of the locals, but when checking for matches, none were found. All this forced them to look for new approaches, to consider events not only in the village, but also around it. It was then that the new detective came across a suspicious connection with an incident that occurred in the neighboring village of Saines. As it turned out, on the same night that Caroline Dickinson was killed, an unknown man entered a youth hostel located in the neighboring village of Saines, where students were spending the night at that time. They came to Brittany on the same principle as schoolchildren from England. The stranger visited the rooms where teenagers were sleeping at that moment. However, he was immediately noticed, the light was turned on and a commotion was raised. Therefore, he was forced to flee. The behavior of the unknown man was strikingly similar to what happened in the youth hostel where Caroline died. Probably, after an unsuccessful attempt at in Saines, the criminal drove 25 kilometers and found himself a new victim. Like other valuable clues, this information was completely ignored during the initial investigation. Since no one was heard in Saines, there was very little data about this person. The detectives were interested in 4 witnesses from the room who caught the probable killer and saw him up close in the light. They were found, interviewed, and they helped to clarify the existing composite sketch. After that, information about the mysterious rapist was spread throughout France. Since the criminal was prone to sexually based attacks, focused his attention on youth hostels and dormitories, information that the police had at that time was also sent to all such institutions. At the same time, information was collected from all such organizations about similar cases of attacks and intrusions into the premises. There was little data, but gradually the list of suspects was replenished. By the end of 1997, about 3,000 men who could have turned out to be criminals were selected from all the inhabitants of the region. To identify the real killer with 100% certainty, all of them needed to be tested and DNA profiles compiled. Of course, such a number of checks required a lot of time, they lasted almost 2 years. The investigators approached the case thoroughly. After a while, they noticed that in the course of the investigation of this case, the same name repeatedly surfaced, Francisco Arce Montes. He was a 47-year-old Spanish citizen who had problems with the law in various European countries. He was first arrested in Germany in the 80s and sentenced to 5 years for Then he committed an attack in the Netherlands, for which he served several months. The next arrest occurred in 1994 in France, when he tried to attack a girl in a youth hostel. His description exactly matched the composite sketch compiled from the words of witnesses. Having delved into the criminal past of this man, the detectives found out that he had at least 10 criminal episodes in Europe, and he acted according to the same scheme. All attacks were associated with of girls and teenagers in youth hostels. Unfortunately, it was not possible to track him down immediately, probably due to the fact that the man was a migrant. He constantly traveled between countries, so he could be anywhere in the European part of the continent and even beyond its borders. By the end of the 1990s, it became known that the name Francisco Arce Montes was well known in all law enforcement agencies in Europe. However, he seemed to have learned about the investigation of his involvement in the Caroline case and disappeared from sight. Until the beginning of the 2000s, his traces could not be recorded. The man became the most suitable character from the list of suspects, but in order to focus on him and reject everyone else, it was necessary to catch Francisco and take his DNA sample. At the same time, testing of suspects continued one by one. They were crossed off the list of 3,000 names. Francisco was hiding so skillfully that even the parents of the victim at some point doubted whether it would be possible to catch him at all. The situation changed only on April 1, 2001, almost 5 years after Caroline's death. On this day, another article dedicated to the girl's death appeared in English newspapers. But now with details in the form of the name and photo of the main suspect, Francisco Arce Montes. On this day, one of the employees of the aviation police from an American airport, who went to lunch, took this newspaper left by one of his colleagues, and came across an article about the tragic death of Caroline Dickinson. The airport employee was surprised that all this time it was still not possible to find the criminal. He saw the name of the main suspect for the first time. Just out of curiosity, the man decided to check if Francisco Montes could have ever visited the United States and stayed in their country. The airport employee entered the name of the main suspect on the computer and, to his surprise, immediately found a very similar one. He also had the last name Arce Montes. The date of birth and photo exactly matched the data published in the newspaper article. He continued his checks and found out that this person was arrested in Florida just 2 weeks before this publication. The suspicious man was detained in Miami Beach during another attack. One March day, students from Chile were vacationing here. They all settled in a youth hostel located on the coast, a few hundred meters from the beach. On the same evening, an unknown man entered one of the rooms of the hostel, where he was caught by 2 female students. They also asked him what he was doing there. But he stated that he had simply confused the rooms, and immediately disappeared. Despite their fears, the girls did not report the strange incident, attributing the man's mistake to his drunken state. However, the very next day, a man similar in description to this stranger was noticed in the same hostel. He was again found in one of the rooms, and he behaved suspiciously. He was seen around 2 o'clock in the morning, after which he also immediately disappeared, saying that he had confused the rooms. The second group of 4 Irish girls immediately contacted the rescue service, reporting an intrusion and one of the girls reported that she was raped in the morning. She provided her underwear for examination and agreed to undergo all the necessary examinations. The police found the mysterious criminal when the next day one of the Irish students recognized him. The girl was in the room that was broken into, and now she saw this suspicious person walking by the pool as if nothing had happened. She immediately called the rescue service, and he was detained. Interestingly, when the detectives approached him, he refused to give his name. After that, he was arrested and taken to the Miami Police Department for interrogation. The unknown man denied involvement in the dubious events that took place over several days in the youth hostel. While communicating with law enforcement officers, he gave his real name. It was Francisco Montes. He also said that he was a lonely traveler, spent a lot of time in South America, European countries, in particular Germany and France, and now travels the United States of America. During a conversation with detectives, he made several peculiar and compromising remarks, insisting that he had not done anything illegal and had simply accidentally entered other people's rooms while intoxicated. Francisco asked several times resentfully if was illegal in the USA, hinting that his actions were not something dangerous. His behavior was arrogant, frankly strange. Eventually, he took a DNA test and was detained pending clarification of the circumstances. When an American airport employee familiarized himself with the police report on Francisco Montes, he was struck by how similar the cases of attacks at the Miami hostel were to the events in France related to the death of Caroline Dickinson. The man realized that the probable criminal could be released on bail at any moment, so he immediately tried to contact the French police and find out everything. The airport employee called several times and even sent emails, but received no response. The man understood, if the French police did not contact their American colleagues as soon as possible, then Francisco Montes could be released and disappear again. At the same time, the airport employee had no evidence that this was the person they were looking for. Finally, in response to one of the airport employee's letters, a French detective called to find out the details. During the conversation, the man tried to explain that the description of the criminal arrested in Miami was very similar to what they were looking for in the case of the murder of Caroline Dickinson. He reported that this man had previously committed crimes in Europe, so it could be the person they were looking for. Unfortunately, the investigator was not sure that this was enough to extradite Francisco to France, because more weighty evidence was needed. However, the airport employee reported that a DNA sample was taken from the criminal while he was in custody in Miami. This greatly interested the French detectives. If it was possible to compare Francisco Montes' DNA with the samples obtained at the scene of Caroline's murder, his involvement could be proved or all suspicions could be dismissed. It was at this moment that hope appeared to finally solve this intricate case. The French police immediately contacted their American colleagues and asked them to take a DNA sample from Francisco Montes while he was under arrest. As soon as the samples were obtained, they were sent to France for comparison with the profile obtained at the crime scene. The result was stunning. Francisco's DNA matched the samples found at the crime scene. This meant that he was the main suspect and probably the girl's killer. Comparing the data took some time, but now it was possible to obtain irrefutable evidence of Francisco Montes' involvement. The extradition procedure was initiated. Finally, in March 2002, after almost 6 years of investigation, the suspect was sent to France. Francisco Montes was charged with the murder of Caroline Dickinson, and he was soon to be formally charged. It was not until June 2004, 8 years after the murder, that the trial began. Unfortunately, Francisco turned out to be not very talkative. All his answers were short and evasive. He mostly refused to testify, despite DNA evidence linking him to the crime. Francisco insisted on his innocence and claimed that he had never seen Caroline, had not visited Pleine-Fougères that night, and had nothing to do with this case at all. Eventually, thanks to DNA samples and other evidence, Francisco Montes was found guilty of raping and murdering Caroline Dickinson. Despite this, he refused to take responsibility or admit his guilt. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. This is the maximum term that he could receive under French law. Caroline's parents were grateful to everyone who helped solve this crime and bring the perpetrator to justice. However, they will never come to terms with the loss of their daughter. Despite the fact that justice has finally been done, for them this is little consolation. Caroline's life was cut short too early and under too tragic circumstances. And no punishment can bring her back to her family. Unfortunately, the language barrier hindered communication between the man and the dispatcher. He did not speak French, and she did not speak English. However, the name Caroline Dickinson was repeated many times during the conversation. Eventually, the dispatcher provided the contact number of a person who could help. This turned out to be a former British consul who had worked as a translator for the local gendarmerie for a long time. At first, the ex-consul was dissatisfied that some stranger had disturbed his peace with an early and tactless call. But he quickly realized the seriousness of the situation. The airport employee shared with him all the information available at that time, including the data from the police reports. The former diplomat also noticed the striking similarity between all the cases of attacks. Finally, there was a real chance to solve the murder of Caroline, but the main obstacle was the distance. Francisco could be released on bail at any moment and disappear without a trace again, leaving for any corner of the world. Now they decided to act together. The airport employee contacted the Miami police, persistently convincing the American law enforcement officers to keep Francisco in custody for as long as possible to conduct the necessary checks. In parallel, through the former consul, a dialogue began with the French detectives. The final argument for them was the message not only of the name of Francisco Montes, but also of his date of birth, which coincided with the data of the French police. It became known that after traveling around Europe, Francisco went to the USA, where he worked as a bouncer. Finally, after his arrest in Florida in March 2001, he was identified as the main suspect in the murder of Caroline Dickinson, committed in France 5 years earlier. By this time, the young people who suffered in Miami had identified Francisco as the man who broke into the hostel room. This allowed him to be held long enough for DNA testing. The result of the analysis of the fluid found on Caroline's body was sent from France for comparison. All this became a moment of truth for European investigators and the girl's parents. A few days later, the test results arrived, showing an almost 100% match. It took 6 months to extradite Francisco Montes from the USA to France. It took another 2 years to get a confession from the criminal. The man admitted to raping a 13-year-old girl in France, but claimed that Caroline Dickinson's death was the result of an accident. In addition, he claimed that he suffered from mental disorders, and therefore was not responsible for his actions. The attempt to avoid punishment due to insanity failed after several examinations. Experts recognized him as healthy and able to stand trial. Throughout the trial, the defendant was not very talkative, mostly communicating in Spanish. He always looked relaxed, with no signs of remorse for what he had done. During his testimony, Francisco told in broken French how the murder happened. According to him, the accused was traveling from Rennes to Fougères, planning to then return to England, where he then lived. Having lost his way, he was looking for a place to spend the night. The only building in the small village where the lights were still on was the youth hostel. He went inside at night and found that everyone was asleep. Looking at the rooms, the man noticed Caroline, who seemed to be an easy prey and was sleeping on the floor. Francisco approached, covering her mouth with his hand, and began to harass her. He raped the girl and accidentally killed her with a wad of cotton that Caroline suffocated on. Frightened, the man fled. During the trial, Francisco even asked for forgiveness from the victim's parents, saying, "I know that the Dickinson family will never forgive me." The parents of the murdered girl, by that time already divorced, together with their younger daughter, were also present at the trial and gave testimony. The mother and father said that their daughter was still a little, innocent girl who just wanted to see the world and visit different countries. Her dream began to come true on this trip. The parents released Caroline on this trip without hesitation, considering France safe and knowing that the girl was under the supervision of teachers. Together with classmates and teachers, she was to visit several interesting places on excursions. No one could have imagined how this trip could end, otherwise they would never have let their daughter go there. The parents did not forgive the criminal. The court revealed details of the defendant's life. Mental problems began in him as a teenager, when symptoms of OCD appeared. He was literally obsessed with hygiene. He opened doors, turned on the light with a handkerchief, tried not to touch anything with his hands, and also thoroughly washed everything with mineral water and soap several times. At the age of 20, Francisco developed his first sexual problems. Having learned about this, acquaintances sent him to a psychiatrist, who diagnosed depression and progressive schizophrenia. In the mid-70s, he left his native Spain and went on a trip to Europe. He led a homeless life, worked part-time as a waiter, doorman in hotels or a driver, but mostly lived on money sent by his father. Acquaintances described that the defendant knew all the youth hostels in Europe and chased after the girls. Moreover, he was most interested in 11 to 12-year-old girls. He considered girls over 20 to be old. Also, his friend said that once, during a conversation, Francisco admitted that he did not see anything wrong with killing a person. It sounded scary. For some time, the defendant had a girlfriend, whom he beat and raped. She even gave birth to a son from him and later left due to physical violence. Then he went on a new journey, where he began to attack and rape. Finally, on June 14, 2004, after a 3-week trial, 54-year-old Francisco Montes was unanimously found guilty of the murder and rape of Caroline. The criminal was sentenced to life imprisonment. Now the victim's parents breathed a sigh of relief. They believed that 8 years of waiting for justice and their activity allowed them to achieve the conviction of their daughter's killer. However, the trials did not end there. As soon as the opportunity arose, the killer immediately filed an appeal. Preparation for the retrial took another year. The case reached the court in June 2005. Francisco was again found guilty, but this time his sentence was reduced to 30 years with the right to parole after 20 years. He filed an appeal again, although he later withdrew it. Everyone was impressed by the list of the villain's crimes. It took about 10 minutes to read it out alone. In the 20 years before his life sentence, he committed 4 rape attacks in Germany, 14 in Spain, and another attempted rape in France. It preceded Caroline's death. Obviously, the real scale of the crimes of this person could be many times greater. But the court dealt only with officially recorded cases when the victims turned to the police. Interestingly, the rest of the victims survived. Perhaps Caroline was his only victim who did not survive. However, American detectives, having familiarized themselves with his case, believe that he is responsible for a series of rapes and murders in the United States and Europe. After the conviction of the killer, a serious question arose as to why he was not stopped all this time. He could have been arrested in Spain as early as the fall of 1997, a year after the murder of Caroline. But he still managed to escape justice. The obstacle to transferring the criminal to the French gendarmerie was the lack of established ways of cooperation between law enforcement officers of European countries. The parents of the murdered girl also drew attention to this. The mother and father of the victim did not calm down after the conviction of Francisco. They continued to raise the issue of the lack of cooperation between the authorities of different countries again and again. This allowed criminals to continue to commit attacks and remain unpunished. To influence the situation, the parents advocated for the creation of an international DNA database, always referring to the story of their daughter. This case has become extremely indicative, demonstrating that cooperation between law enforcement agencies, even on different continents, is able to stop an insidious villain. For Francisco, the trials in Caroline's case did not end. In 2015, the criminal was found guilty of raping a girl that happened a year after the murder of the schoolgirl. He was extradited to Spain for trial in the case of the rape of an 18-year-old girl. The man tricked the victim into letting him into the apartment building where she lived with her family, claiming that he had lost his keys. Then he attacked her, threatening with a knife, and raped her. For this crime, he was sentenced in Spain to 11 years in prison. After that, he was returned to prison in France to serve his sentence for taking a life. Gradually, Francisco's appeals ran out. Having served his imprisonment for the murder of Caroline, he will be extradited to Spain, where he will have to serve another 11 years. His earliest opportunity for release will come in 2038. However, it is unlikely that the killer criminal will live behind bars to his 88th birthday. Please write your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. For those who are new here, subscribing is the best way to stay updated on future content. Also give a like please. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thank you for your support during this difficult time. Until next time, friends.